Okay, in part two of this week's content, I'm going to touch upon two specific figures, figures in and of capitalism, and the political figures that young people are kind of positioned as. These figures that I'm talking about here, I think, are most prevalent in the media, in popular culture, and in political representations of young people. So you can see, I've given some examples here. On one side, you have the very typical representation of young people, apparently in this art gallery and completely ignoring the art, and they're all on their phones. On the other side, you have the kind of use of young, sexy, edgy bodies to sell us stuff. These are kind of, I think, key figures in capitalism. Now, importantly, the photo there of the young people on their phones is actually really a distortion of what's going on. So there were some stories that came out about this, using this photo as a kind of example of moral panic kind of perceptions of how young people are, ignorant and, vapid and, slave to their phones and all that kind of stuff. But what this is actually a photo of is of a whole group of young people that were on an excursion. I'm pretty sure it's to the Louvre that's in France, in Paris, where they were going around the gallery and they looked at the different artwork, and here they were asked by the teachers to get on their phones and look up some information and do some study on the spot about the different artworks. And I think this is a good example of the affordances of this kind of technology, that while it can be seen as a constant form of infinite distraction, it's also a way of us being able to find out information, to do research, and to contextualise what's going on around us at a particular time. So again, here's a good example, I think, of the way that media can distort what's going on in terms of just the kind of inaccurate and sometimes deliberate usage of images that aren't really conveying what they truly mean. So in terms of these figures, on one hand you have the figure of the young mindless consumer, the cultural dupe from, this will be recognisable to those students who have looked at the work of the Frankfurt School in Soccer 1010. And here young people are generally just seen as mindlessly consuming, vapid, a complete product of ideology. They're completely unreflexive. They seem to have no ability to think about the wider world. And this is often a kind of figure of young person that appears in moral panics about pop culture, whether it's about, listening to rap is going to make young people violent, or, social media panics, panics about social media and Facebook and bullying and things like that. So this certainly resonates with the at-risk and the risk-taking figures that I'll talk about later in this week's content. But I would say that this figure seems to go all the way back throughout history. I mean, the likes of Aristotle and Plato were writing about young people, from an adult perspective, through this kind of lens back then. The second figure that I'd like to kind of think about in terms of capitalism is what I'm calling the sexy, cool, edgy figures. And these figures are used for co-optation, for selling us stuff. And this is the figure of young people that appears in advertising, in PR, in different kinds of pop culture. And as the quote from Harry Blatterer says here, labour and commodity markets have liberated youthfulness from its biological, age-determined delimitations and have recast select, desirable, i.e. profitable, characteristics of youth as necessary for the maximisation of individuals' life chances. Young people within capitalism are positioned in a particular way. Their bodies are mined for spectacular and sexy images to sell us stuff. They're more resistive forms of youth culture, whether it's subcultures or artwork or the likes, are often then co-opted and kind of reconfigured back into more mainstream popular culture. And as work that myself and Julia Coffey and David Ferrugia have been doing, young people are kind of used in what we call immaterial and effective labour. Increasingly in the service labour market where many young people work, their very presence is really important in terms of creating a certain vibe. So whether that's in kind of a hipster bar in the kind of northern suburbs of Melbourne, or the South Bank of Melbourne, or more kind of brand named kind of nightclubby kind of thing, the very images, the very tastes of young people are used in the ways that they're employed to create a vibe and to kind of entice similar people to those venues. So that's a way of thinking about how the youth and their very livelihoods are sometimes increasingly based on their lifestyles and on their images and on their fashion. And these things are kind of brought into the labour market, and they're not paid for this. They're still paid those kind of, award wages or less than. So again, this is a kind of way of thinking about that, how young people do this immaterial labour. That's very a part of being a new kind of form of what's called cool capitalism. The second figure I'd like to talk about in this section is the political nature of the way that youth is presented. So on the one hand, you tend to have moral panics. They're drawing out in all kinds of political moral panics that I've spoken about a little bit already. But on the other hand, there's the kind of young person as this kind of revolutionary figure, a figure of agents of change. So you have figures in moral panics and you have these revolutionary ways, kind of a dichotomy of the ways that young people are presented in terms of the political beings. I've spoken a little bit about moral panic already, but they tend to be, presented in this kind of three interconnecting kind of forms of moral panic. The ways that young people live, their lifestyles are pretty much constantly, there's a barrage of these things in the media, whether it's, about, pop culture, whether it's they're disloyal or lazy or irresponsible, politically ignorant, that kind of thing. And these kind of coincide a lot with the generational stuff that I'll talk about in a minute. Connected to these lifestyle choices, there's the notions of deviance that are constantly attached to young people's lifestyles, and whether that's about, increased risk-taking, driving cars fast, sex, drugs, rock and roll, that kind of stuff. What's interesting about this is I think that adults, seem to very quickly forget what it's like to be young and, forget about all the risks that they probably took as well. Third is the kind of protection of young people, threats and risks to young people. What I like to refer to as the Mrs. Lovejoy version of it, from The Simpsons, will somebody think of the children? Young people are represented in moral panics like this all the time, and it is one of the key ways that their images are disseminated in the news media and pop culture. On the other hand, there's kind of what I'm calling revolutionary figures. Young people seem to always be positioned at the vanguard of social change, whether that's global uprisings recently, around the use of Twitter and Facebook in the Arab Spring, or whether it's the recent Occupy movement. They seem often to be positioned as kind of youth-led movements. And as Sikaria and Tannock have pointed out, this is sometimes a bit of a distortion of what's actually going on. So at once they're positioned as a kind of agents of change. Remember that in other moral panics, they're positioned as being politically vapid, so these two things seem to be going on at once. But this kind of downplays what these movements are often about. They often seem to be then presented as kind of these enthusiastic youth things. Young people will grow out of it, and eventually what they're saying is not that important. And this tends to kind of short-circuit the very kind of important things that these movements are trying to do. Kind of positions uprisings as youthful exuberance rather than a real social and political expression of the deep-seated problems that young people face. So it also tends to distort the actual involvement of adults in these movements, and often these movements kind of often look like they happen quite suddenly, but are the kind of product of sometimes decades of political organisation. What seems to happen then, as far as Sikaria and Tannock are concerned, is that these uprisings then get framed in the media as a kind of way to admire the kind of pluckiness of young people, while kind of obfuscating what's actually going on, whether these things are representations of class, race, gender, colonialism, labour market precarity and the like. It also means that if they are actually youth-led movements, that they kind of be short-lived. In the movements, young people very rarely take up leadership roles, but particularly in large-scale, urban uprisings, young people are the ones that get disproportionately killed and arrested and displaced. So again, these two figures here, these political figures that I'm pointing out, I think are ways of thinking about the politics of youth and the ways that young people are represented. And there's two, I think, opposing kind of figures that can help us draw out in the ways that they're presented in this kind of realm. Thanks.